May 7, 1942. Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters. Commander Takeshi Yamada stood before the intelligence briefing board, staring at grainy photographs of what the Americans were calling their new landing craft. The vessel looked absurd. A flat-bottomed barge with a simple ramp at the bow, no armor to speak of, constructed from plywood and held together with what appeared to be little more than rivets and hope. Around him, senior officers of the combined fleet studied the images with expressions ranging from amusement to outright contempt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Yamada's pen hovered over his notebook, the characters forming slowly as doubt crept into his thoughts. They expect to challenge our defenses with these toy boats. Washington believes wooden boxes will carry their soldiers across the Pacific, onto beaches we have fortified for months. I want to believe our coastal positions are impregnable. I want to believe that any invasion force using such primitive vessels will be slaughtered in the surf before a single soldier reaches dry sand. But I have studied the Americans. I have read their technical journals. I have watched their industrial capacity grow. And something in these photographs troubles me in ways I cannot articulate to my superiors without inviting accusations of defeatism. The meeting room buzzed with confident dismissal as Rear Admiral Hideaki Matsumoto tapped the photographs with his pointer. The vessels displayed such obvious limitations that detailed analysis seemed unnecessary. No meaningful armor plating. A maximum speed the Admiral estimated at perhaps 8 knots. Vulnerable to even light artillery fire. The flat-bottom design suggested poor handling in anything beyond calm seas. Most critically, the simple bow ramp represented a fatal tactical flaw, requiring the craft to approach perpendicular to the beach, presenting the most vulnerable profile to defensive fire. Matsumoto's presentation concluded with an assessment that drew nods of agreement throughout the room. These landing craft represented desperation rather than innovation. The Americans, having lost access to proper naval architects following their Pacific defeats, had resorted to civilian boat builders producing cheap vessels in quantity rather than quality. Any invasion fleet relying on such craft would be destroyed long before reaching Japanese-held beaches. Vice Admiral Shigeru Tanaka, commanding defensive operations for the Southern Resources Area, listened to these assessments with growing satisfaction. His coastal defense strategy assumed that amphibious assaults represented the most vulnerable moment in any military operation. Troops packed into slow-moving vessels presented perfect targets for pre-registered artillery fire. The transition from sea to land, when soldiers were most exposed and least capable of tactical maneuver, was when defensive forces held overwhelming advantage. The photographs of American landing craft confirmed everything Tanaka's defensive doctrine assumed about amphibious warfare. Landing operations required specialized vessels that could carry troops directly onto beaches. Such vessels would necessarily be large, slow, and vulnerable. The Americans had produced exactly the kind of target Tanaka's defense plans were designed to destroy. His artillery batteries, positioned on heights overlooking landing beaches throughout the Pacific, would have clear fields of fire against these flat-bottomed barges as they approached shore. Machine gun nests positioned behind beach obstacles would massacre any troops who survived the artillery barrage. The Americans would learn what the British had learned at Gallipoli, that well-defended beaches were killing grounds where attackers died by the thousands. What none of these senior officers understood was that the photographs showed only the exterior of a vessel whose true innovation lay not in armor or speed, but in a design philosophy that would revolutionize amphibious warfare. The Higgins boat, formerly designated the LCVP Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, represented a solution to problems that Japanese military planners did not fully comprehend because they had never seriously considered offensive amphibious operations on the scale the Americans were planning. Andrew Jackson Higgins had designed his boat not for the military, but for navigating the shallow bayous and swamps of Louisiana. A boat builder from New Orleans, Higgins understood that operating in shallow water required a flat bottom and a bow that could drive directly onto mud banks. When the United States Marine Corps began searching for landing craft designs in the late 1930s, they tested vessels from numerous manufacturers. Most failed because they drew too much water, grounded too far from shore, or lacked the ability to retract from beaches once troops had disembarked. Higgins' design succeeded because it solved all these problems simultaneously. The flat bottom allowed operation in as little as 3 feet of water. The bow ramp, which Japanese officers saw as a vulnerability, actually represented the craft's greatest tactical innovation. Previous landing craft required troops to climb over the sides, exposing them to fire while they were most vulnerable. The bow ramp allowed soldiers to charge directly forward the moment the craft grounded, minimizing exposure time. The boat's simple construction meant it could be mass-produced by furniture factories and boat works throughout America. The wooden hull, which Japanese analysts dismissed as inadequate, actually absorbed small arms fire better than thin steel plating and could be repaired quickly using materials available anywhere. But the true revolutionary aspect of the Higgins boat lay not in any single feature, but in how it transformed the fundamental mathematics of amphibious assault. Traditional landing operations relied on seizing ports or using beaches where ships could anchor offshore and ferry troops to land over extended periods. This gave defenders time to concentrate forces and counterattack. The Higgins boat changed this equation entirely. Each craft carried 36 combat-equipped soldiers or a vehicle and crew. With thousands of these boats, an invasion force could land entire divisions in hours rather than days, overwhelming defensive positions before reinforcements could arrive. Commander Yamada understood none of this technical detail during that May 1942 briefing, but his instincts warned him that dismissing American capabilities based on superficial assessment was dangerous. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington before the war and witnessed American industrial organization firsthand. Americans approached war not as a test of warrior spirit, but as an engineering problem to be solved through mass production and logistical efficiency. If they were building these simple landing craft in large numbers, there was likely a systematic plan behind the decision. His concerns went unvoiced. The meeting concluded with confident assessments of Japanese defensive superiority and dismissive attitudes toward American amphibious capabilities. Senior officers filed out, already focusing on other matters. Yamada remained, studying the photographs with growing unease. The Americans had lost battleships at Pearl Harbor but emerged from that disaster with determination to rebuild. They had lost the Philippines but began planning for eventual return. They showed no indication of accepting defeat despite early Japanese victories. And now they were building thousands of these simple landing craft. The implications troubled him deeply. Across the Pacific, in a New Orleans boatyard that had been transformed into a sprawling production facility, Andrew Higgins supervised the construction of landing craft with the intensity of a man who understood his designs would determine whether American soldiers lived or died. His workers, many of them women who had replaced men gone to fight, assembled boats with assembly line efficiency that would have impressed Henry Ford. Plywood panels cut to exact specifications. Engines installed and tested. Bow ramps fitted and calibrated. Each boat taking shape in days rather than weeks. Higgins had fought bitter battles with the Navy's Bureau of Ships, which initially favored designs from established naval architecture firms. The Bureau wanted steel hulls and complex machinery. Higgins offered wood and simplicity. The Bureau wanted vessels that looked like proper military craft. Higgins delivered boats that looked like barges but functioned perfectly for their intended purpose. The breakthrough came when the Marine Corps tested Higgins' designs against Bureau-approved alternatives and found the Louisiana boat builders' simple craft outperformed everything else. By mid-1942, Higgins Industries employed over 20,000 workers producing landing craft at a rate of more than 700 boats per month. The company had expanded beyond its original New Orleans facilities to operate plants throughout Louisiana. Each facility operated around the clock, 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. The sound of saws cutting plywood and hammers driving rivets never stopped. Partly completed hulls moved down assembly lines while quality inspectors checked each vessel against specifications that demanded reliability over aesthetics. The boats emerging from these facilities were not beautiful. Compared to sleek destroyers or graceful cruisers, they looked crude and utilitarian. But they worked. The flat bottom that Japanese analysts mocked allowed these craft to approach within feet of shorelines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The simple construction meant battle damage could be repaired quickly using basic tools and materials. The bow ramp that seemed like a vulnerability actually represented the difference between soldiers reaching beaches alive or dying in the surf. Lieutenant Robert Chin of the United States Marine Corps first encountered Higgins boats during training operations in California in June 1942. His company had been practicing amphibious assault techniques using borrowed Navy motor launches that required troops to scramble over the sides while the boats wallowed in the surf. The casualties in these training exercises, though simulated, suggested that actual combat landings would be slaughterhouses. Then the Higgins boats arrived. Chin watched the first demonstration with skepticism that transformed into understanding within minutes. The craft approached the beach at full speed, engines roaring. At the last moment, the coxswain cut power and the flat bottom allowed the boat to glide directly onto sand. The bow ramp dropped instantly and Marines charged forward exactly as they would in combat. The entire process from approaching shore to delivering troops onto dry sand took less than 60 seconds. Chin realized immediately that these simple boats had solved the fundamental problem that had made amphibious assault so dangerous throughout military history. His company practiced landing operations for weeks, learning to coordinate boat waves, establish beachheads, and push inland while subsequent waves landed supplies and reinforcements. The Higgins boats made it possible to land 600 men in 10 minutes. An entire battalion could be ashore in half an hour. A full regiment in 2 hours. The mathematics of amphibious assault had changed fundamentally. Defenders would face not a gradual buildup they could contain and counterattack, but a sudden overwhelming force that would establish positions before response was possible. Chin's battalion commander, Major James Fitzgerald, understood the strategic implications better than most officers at his level. Traditional amphibious doctrine, based on Gallipoli and other disasters, assumed that landing operations required prolonged preparation, extensive naval bombardment, and acceptance of heavy casualties during the vulnerable landing phase. The Higgins boat changed all these assumptions. With enough boats, an amphibious force could land so rapidly that defensive preparations became irrelevant. Speed and mass replaced the need for prolonged bombardment. The vulnerable landing phase compressed from hours to minutes. Fitzgerald had studied Japanese defensive positions in the Pacific with intelligence photographs that showed exactly the kind of fixed fortifications Admiral Tanaka was so confident would destroy American landings. Bunkers positioned to cover beaches with intersecting fields of fire. Artillery pre-registered on likely landing zones. Beach obstacles designed to stop landing craft offshore. All of these preparations assumed that landing forces would approach slowly, predictably, and present sustained targets. None of these assumptions accounted for what would happen when hundreds of boats landed simultaneously, depositing thousands of troops onto beaches in minutes. By August 1942, Higgins Industries was producing more than 1,000 boats per month, with additional contracts pushing toward even higher production rates. The craft were shipped to assembly points throughout the Pacific and in Britain, where preparations for eventual European invasion operations were already beginning. American planners were designing amphibious operations on a scale never before attempted, operations that would have been impossible without the simple, ugly, effective boats that Japanese admirals had dismissed as toys. Commander Yamada received updated intelligence reports throughout late 1942 that should have alarmed Japanese defensive planners but instead reinforced their confidence. American production of landing craft was accelerating dramatically. Thousands of boats were being built. Training operations in California and Hawaii involved increasingly large formations practicing complex landing operations. Rather than seeing these developments as evidence of serious American capabilities, Japanese staff officers interpreted them as proof that the Americans needed massive numbers of inferior craft to compensate for poor quality. The reasoning followed a logical pattern that happened to be completely wrong. Americans were building thousands of simple boats because they lacked the naval architecture expertise to design proper landing vessels. They were practicing extensively because their troops lacked the superior training and fighting spirit of Japanese soldiers. They were massing enormous quantities of equipment because they relied on material superiority rather than warrior excellence. Every piece of evidence that should have suggested American competence was instead interpreted as confirmation of American weakness. Yamada tried to challenge these assumptions in staff meetings, pointing out that American industrial capacity should not be dismissed simply because it produced different solutions than Japanese planning would favor. He noted that the Louisiana boat builder's simple design might actually represent elegant engineering rather than crude desperation. He suggested that massing thousands of landing craft might enable tactical approaches that Japanese defensive planning had not anticipated. His objections were noted politely and ignored completely. The fundamental problem was that Japanese military doctrine in 1942 was built on assumptions about warfare that emphasized individual soldier quality, spiritual strength, and tactical excellence at small unit level. These assumptions had served Japan well in the early phases of Pacific fighting, where Japanese forces consistently demonstrated superior jungle warfare skills, better night combat capabilities, and greater willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives. Japanese officers had watched their troops defeat larger American and British forces through superior tactics and determination. They had good reason for confidence. What they failed to understand was that the nature of warfare was shifting beneath their feet. Modern industrial war was becoming a contest not primarily of tactical skill or individual courage, but of logistics, industrial production, and systematic application of overwhelming material force. The Americans were not trying to match Japanese soldiers in individual combat capability. They were creating a system where individual combat capability became less relevant because American forces would arrive in such overwhelming numbers with such massive fire support that tactical excellence could not compensate for material disadvantage. The Higgins boat represented one component of this systematic approach. By itself, each boat was insignificant. Collectively, thousands of boats transformed amphibious assault from a specialized operation requiring perfect conditions into a routine capability that could be executed anywhere at any time with minimal preparation. Japanese defensive planning assumed that amphibious assault was inherently difficult and dangerous, requiring attackers to accept heavy casualties. American planning, enabled by the Higgins boat, assumed that amphibious assault could be made relatively safe and routine through proper equipment and sufficient force. By October 1942, these competing visions would be tested at Guadalcanal, though not in the way Japanese planners anticipated. The initial American landing on August 7 had caught Japanese forces by surprise, establishing a beachhead before defenders could organize effective resistance. Japanese counterattacks focused on destroying the landed Marines through ground combat rather than preventing the landing itself. The battle became a grinding attrition contest around Henderson Field rather than a test of amphibious assault doctrine. But the campaign revealed something critically important about American logistics that Japanese observers failed to appreciate fully. Despite operating at the end of an extended supply line and facing determined Japanese efforts to interdict supplies, American forces on Guadalcanal remained consistently better supplied than their Japanese opponents. Part of this advantage stemmed from American air superiority and naval control during daylight hours. But another critical factor was the landing craft that could run supplies onto beaches quickly under cover of darkness or between Japanese air attacks. Higgins boats proved invaluable for these resupply operations. They could approach beaches too shallow for larger vessels, unload rapidly, and withdraw before Japanese artillery could register fire. Each boat carried supplies or reinforcements that would have required hours to offload using traditional ship-to-shore methods. Across months of fighting, this capability allowed Americans to sustain forces that should have been cut off and defeated. Lieutenant Chen's company participated in resupply operations to Guadalcanal in November 1942, making night runs in Higgins boats loaded with ammunition and rations for Marines holding positions around Henderson Field. The operations were terrifying, running in darkness toward beaches that might be under Japanese attack, listening for the sounds of artillery or machine gun fire that would indicate they were approaching a hot landing zone. But the boats made it possible. They could navigate in shallow water close to shore where larger vessels could not go. They could ground directly on beaches and retract within minutes. They could operate in conditions that made conventional ship-to-shore logistics impossible. Chin watched supplies pile up on Guadalcanal beaches faster than Marines could distribute them inland and understood viscerally what this meant for future operations. American forces would never lack ammunition or food or medical supplies as long as the beaches remained open and boats kept running. Japanese forces, by contrast, relied on destroyers making high-speed runs down the slot, unloading whatever supplies they carried before American air power could intercept them. The logistics were completely asymmetrical, favoring American forces despite Japanese forces operating closer to their major bases. By the end of 1942, Guadalcanal had been secured and American planners were designing the next phase of Pacific operations. The lessons learned in the Solomon Islands campaign informed planning for future amphibious assaults. More boats would be needed. Better coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and landing waves would be required. But the fundamental concept had been validated. Amphibious assault using Higgins boats could land forces rapidly enough to establish beachheads before defenders could mass for counterattack. Admiral Tanaka, studying reports from Guadalcanal, should have recognized that his defensive doctrine had been tested and found wanting. American forces had landed successfully, established positions, and sustained those positions despite Japanese efforts to counterattack. The landing craft that intelligence photos had dismissed as toys had performed exactly their intended function. But Tanaka, like many Japanese officers, attributed the Guadalcanal outcome to specific local factors rather than fundamental flaws in defensive planning. The garrison had been surprised and undermanned. Naval support had been inadequate. Air cover had been insufficient. With proper preparation and adequate forces, future American landing attempts would be defeated. This conviction shaped Japanese defensive preparations throughout 1943 as American forces began their advance through the Solomon Islands and across the Central Pacific. Each island that stood in the path of American advance received reinforced garrisons, expanded fortifications, and detailed defensive plans designed to destroy landing forces in the surf or immediately after reaching shore. Artillery was positioned to cover beaches with pre-registered fire. Machine gun nests were built into coral outcroppings and concrete bunkers. Beach obstacles were in place to channelize landing craft into killing zones. Defensive positions were hardened to withstand naval bombardment. Everything about these preparations assumed that American forces would land gradually, that defensive fire would inflict heavy casualties during the vulnerable landing phase, and that Japanese forces would have time to organize counterattacks against established beachheads. Everything about these assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. Commander Yamada, now promoted to captain and assigned to defensive planning staff, watched these preparations with growing dread. He had obtained more detailed intelligence about American landing craft production and the numbers were staggering. Higgins Industries alone was producing over 2,000 boats per month. Additional manufacturers were adding thousands more. The Americans were building an armada of landing craft that dwarfed anything in military history. He tried again to raise concerns in staff meetings, pointing out that if Americans could land 20,000 troops in a single morning using massed landing craft, then defensive plans based on defeating gradual landings would fail. His objections were acknowledged and dismissed. Japanese doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. American reliance on massing cheap equipment proved their material thinking rather than warrior spirit. When the test came, Japanese defenders would prove that courage and proper tactics could overcome material advantage. The test came at Tarawa in November 1943, and it proved exactly nothing that Japanese planners believed. The battle lasted 76 hours. Over 4,500 Americans landed in the first hours, establishing beachheads despite horrific casualties. The garrison fought with exactly the courage and determination that Japanese doctrine emphasized. Every position was defended until overrun. No ground was yielded willingly. The Americans suffered over 3,000 casualties, including more than 1,000 dead. And the Americans won decisively. They landed in such overwhelming force that Japanese defenders could not kill them fast enough to prevent beachhead establishment. they brought such massive fire support that defensive positions were systematically destroyed. They kept landing reinforcements and supplies until resistance collapsed. The mathematics of the engagement showed brutally that even a garrison fighting to the last man could not defeat an amphibious assault delivered by thousands of boats landing simultaneously. Major Fitzgerald, commanding a battalion that landed in the second wave at Tarawa, witnessed the price of underestimating American capabilities. The beaches were killing grounds exactly as Japanese planners intended. Marines died by the hundreds in the water and on the sand. Some boats struck coral reefs offshore and troops had to wade hundreds of yards under machine gun fire. The scene resembled every nightmare about amphibious assault that military planners had dreaded since Gallipoli. And yet the landing succeeded because the boats kept coming. Wave after wave of Higgins boats grounded on beaches or reefs, dropped their ramps, and deposited Marines who charged forward despite casualties. The Japanese defenders fought magnificently, but they were overwhelmed by sustained pressure that never relented. By the second day, the beachhead was secure and the outcome was no longer in doubt. The garrison could inflict casualties but could not prevent eventual defeat. Fitzgerald walked the beaches after the fighting ended, past destroyed boats and fallen Marines and wrecked Japanese positions, and understood that this would be the pattern for every future operation. Americans would land in overwhelming force using these simple boats. They would accept casualties in the initial assault. They would establish beachheads through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Japanese garrisons would fight courageously and die almost to the last man, but they would lose because modern warfare had become a contest of industrial production and logistical capacity rather than warrior excellence. Captain Yamada received detailed reports from Tarawa that should have prompted fundamental reassessment of defensive doctrine. The garrison had performed exactly as doctrine prescribed. Fortifications had been well constructed and well positioned. Defenders had fought with determination unto death. And the position had fallen in 3 days because Americans landed with such massive force and sustained such continuous pressure that tactical excellence could not compensate for numerical and material disadvantage. He drafted a memorandum arguing that future defensive planning must account for American ability to land 20,000 or more troops in opening hours of any assault. Traditional approaches of defending at the beach and counterattacking established positions would fail against such overwhelming force. New doctrine was needed that emphasized defense in depth, mobile reserves, and acceptance that Americans would successfully land in any location they chose to assault. His memorandum was acknowledged and filed. Senior officers were not prepared to accept that Japanese defensive capabilities were fundamentally inadequate against American industrial capacity. The Tarawa garrison had been overrun, but this outcome was attributed to specific local factors. The reef had prevented proper beach defense. Naval bombardment had been more effective than anticipated. The garrison had been slightly undermanned. With better preparation and more forces, future defensive efforts would succeed. This fundamental refusal to accept that the rules of warfare had changed would characterize Japanese defensive planning throughout the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Each island fortress would be built on assumptions that American assault forces could be defeated through proper tactics and sufficient determination. Each garrison would fight courageously according to doctrine. And each position would fall because doctrine was based on assumptions about amphibious warfare that Higgins boats and American industrial capacity had rendered obsolete. By early 1944, American forces were preparing for operations that would test amphibious assault capability on unprecedented scale. The Marshall Islands campaign would involve multiple simultaneous landings across thousands of miles of ocean. The Marianas Campaign would target islands defended by substantial garrisons with months to prepare defensive positions. The eventual Philippines invasion would be the largest amphibious operation in Pacific War history. All of these campaigns were possible only because America now possessed tens of thousands of landing craft and had refined amphibious assault doctrine into a systematic process that could be executed reliably under diverse conditions. Higgins Industries had become the largest private employer in Louisiana, operating multiple production facilities that collectively produced over 3,000 boats per month. The company's workforce had expanded to over 30,000 workers, many of them African Americans and women who would have been excluded from industrial employment before the war. Higgins himself insisted on integrated work crews and equal pay regardless of race or gender, policies that generated controversy in 1940s Louisiana but that maximized production efficiency by drawing on all available labor. The boats rolling off these assembly lines were being shipped to staging areas throughout the Pacific, Mediterranean, and Britain. Each major operation required hundreds of boats to be allocated from the growing fleet. Boats were lost to enemy action, weather damage, and simple wear and tear, but production exceeded losses by wide margins. By mid-1944, the United States possessed more landing craft than the rest of the world combined, a naval capability that transformed strategic possibilities. The Saipan landing on June 15, 1944 demonstrated everything Japanese defensive planners had refused to accept. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded 30,000 troops positioned across fortified positions that had been prepared for 8 months. Intelligence reports warned him that Americans possessed overwhelming naval and air superiority, but Saito believed his defenses would exact such terrible casualties that the invasion would stall on the beaches. His artillery had pre-registered every likely landing zone. Machine gun positions covered approaches with interlocking fire. The garrison was well supplied and determined to fight. At dawn, the horizon filled with ships. Then the boats appeared. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Higgins' boats formed waves stretching across miles of ocean, each carrying Marines or soldiers toward 8 separate landing beaches simultaneously. Sato's artillery opened fire, destroying boats and killing men in the water. But the boats kept coming. Wave after wave grounded on beaches, dropped ramps, and deposited troops who charged inland under covering fire from naval guns and aircraft. Within 2 hours, 20,000 Americans were ashore. By nightfall, the number had doubled. Sato's defenses, designed to stop a gradual landing, were overwhelmed by sustained pressure that never relented. His troops fought courageously, counterattacking repeatedly, but they were fighting mathematics they could not defeat. Every destroyed boat was replaced by 3 more. Every defended position was bypassed or obliterated by naval gunfire. The Americans kept landing men and equipment until resistance became futile. Captain Yamada, now serving on Admiral Toyoda's staff, received reports from Saipan with the sick certainty of a man watching predicted disaster unfold. The garrison was fighting exactly according to doctrine. The defensive positions were well constructed. Japanese troops were demonstrating their traditional courage. And the island was falling because Americans had landed such overwhelming force in the opening hours that the outcome had been determined before the battle truly began. He drafted another memorandum arguing that defensive doctrine must change, that Japan could not win battles by defending beaches against an enemy capable of landing 50,000 troops in a single day. The memorandum went further than previous attempts, stating bluntly that the war was being lost because Japanese planning refused to accept that industrial capacity now determined military outcomes more than warrior spirit or tactical skill. The response was swift and threatening. Yamada was warned that such defeatist analysis bordered on treason. He was reminded that Japanese forces had never been defeated when properly led and supplied. The Saipan garrison would fight to the last man and inflict casualties that would shock the American public into demanding negotiated peace. Yamada said nothing more, understanding that the truth would not be accepted until defeat became undeniable. The pattern repeated across the Pacific through 1944 and into 1945. At Guam, Americans landed 40,000 troops in the first day. At Peleliu, 15,000 Marines came ashore in waves that overwhelmed defenses through sheer mass. At Iwo Jima, 30,000 troops landed on opening day against a garrison that had spent months preparing the most sophisticated defensive positions in the Pacific. The garrison fought for 36 days, inflicting 26,000 American casualties, and was annihilated without preventing the island's capture. Lieutenant Chen, now a captain commanding a rifle company, landed at Okinawa on April 1, 1945 in what would be the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. His Higgins boat was one of 1,500 that hit the beaches in the first hours. He watched boats stretch to the horizon in both directions, an armada of simple wooden craft delivering an invasion force that numbered over 180,000 troops. The landing faced minimal opposition initially. The Japanese garrison, finally learning from previous disasters, had withdrawn inland to defensive positions that could not be destroyed by naval bombardment. But this tactical adjustment changed nothing about the fundamental strategic reality. Americans established beachheads, built up overwhelming combat power, and ground through defensive positions with systematic application of superior firepower. The battle lasted 82 days and cost over 12,000 American lives, but the outcome was never in doubt once the landing succeeded. Chin walked through supply dumps on Okinawa beaches that stretched for miles, mountains of ammunition and equipment and fuel delivered by those simple boats that Japanese admirals had mocked 3 years earlier. The Higgins boats had made all of this possible. They had transformed amphibious assault from a specialized operation into routine capability. They had enabled an island-hopping campaign that crossed the Pacific in less than 3 years. They had rendered obsolete every defensive doctrine based on stopping invasions at the waterline. After the war, Admiral Tanaka wrote his memoirs from a prison cell where he awaited trial for war crimes. His assessment of why Japan lost the Pacific War began with a single sentence. We failed to understand that modern warfare is decided by logistics and industrial production rather than tactical excellence or warrior spirit. The Americans built simple boats by the thousands and used them to land overwhelming force wherever they chose. We built sophisticated defenses and fought courageously, and we lost because courage cannot defeat mathematics. Commander Yamada survived the war and served briefly in Japan's post-war maritime self-defense force before retiring to teach naval history. His lectures emphasized the Higgins boat as the weapon that won the Pacific War, not through any technological superiority, but through elegant simplicity mass-produced beyond Japanese capacity to counter. Students would ask about submarines or aircraft carriers or battleships, and Yamada would redirect them to photographs of ugly wooden boats with bow ramps. Those boats, he would explain, made everything else possible. They turned amphibious assault from theoretical operation into practical capability. They gave Americans the ability to attack anywhere, forcing Japanese forces to defend everywhere, spreading resources until effective defense became impossible. Andrew Higgins received the Legion of Merit for his contributions to the war effort, though his boats received less public attention than tanks or aircraft. Eisenhower later wrote that Higgins was the man who won the war for us, a statement that many found hyperbolic until they understood the full scope of what those simple boats had enabled. Without them, the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible. Without them, the Normandy invasion could not have been executed. Without them, the United States could not have projected military power across 2 oceans simultaneously. The final accounting was stark. Japanese forces destroyed thousands of Higgins boats during the Pacific War. They killed tens of thousands of American troops during amphibious landings. They demonstrated tactical skill and personal courage that commanded respect even from enemies. None of it mattered because the boats kept coming and the troops kept landing and the supplies kept flowing until every defended island fell. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan could not build defenses faster than America could build boats. Japanese forces could not kill American troops faster than boats could deliver replacements. Courage and tactical skill could not overcome the simple reality that modern industrial war was won by logistics. By war's end, over 20,000 Higgins boats had been produced. They had carried millions of troops onto hostile shores. They had delivered the supplies that sustained those troops. They had revolutionized amphibious warfare so completely that every subsequent landing craft design borrowed from their basic principles. The Japanese admirals who had mocked them as toys learned too late that in modern warfare, the side that could deliver overwhelming force rapidly to any location would defeat the side that relied on defending fixed positions with superior tactics. The lesson would shape military planning for generations. Mobility and mass production mattered more than fortification and fighting spirit. Logistics determined outcomes more than tactics. And sometimes the most revolutionary weapon was not the most sophisticated or powerful, but the simplest and most easily mass-produced. the Higgins boat proved that winning modern wars required not just brave soldiers and skilled commanders, but the industrial capacity to deliver those soldiers wherever they were needed in overwhelming numbers. Japan had the soldiers and the commanders. America had the boats. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.